Welcome to the Austrian Military Academy. I'm Colonel Markus Reisner. I'm the head of the Institute 1 Officers Basic Training. And today we will have a look at the situation in Ukraine at day 820. As it looks like the Russian momentum is back. And why is this the case? We'll have a look in the next slides in detail on that situation. The starting point of today's video is phase 6, the so-called second Russian winter offensive. You might think that there was nothing going on the Eastern Front, but there was already a lot going on actually. We thought during the last months that the Russians tried to attack the Ukrainian positions along the whole front line, which spreads over a distance of 1,200 kilometers. It was clearly visible that the momentum went to the Russian side during the last months. There was only one area where the Ukrainians were able to attack the Russians, and by using unmanned, uncrewed sea systems, the Ukrainian side managed to force the Russian fleet to withdraw direction east. To give you an idea what it looked like to attack from the Russian side Ukrainian positions, we would like to show you a video. In the video you can see a mixture of different weapon systems. You can see mines, artillery including cluster ammunition, first-person view drones and anti-tank weapons. Now let's have a look at the typical 3 different warfighting levels. First, the strategic level and the strategic objectives of the Russian side. Like it was during the first Russian winter offensive, parallel to the land operations of the Russians, the Russian Air Force tried, by conducting a strategic air campaign, to destroy the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. We know that the manufacturing rate of cruise missiles and rockets is stable at around 150 to 130 cruise missiles and rockets a month. And using those assets, the Russian can maintain a huge operational tempo to fight against the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. To give you an example on these strategic attacks, I would like to show you these 2 pictures, where you can see the pattern which is used by the Russian side. This slide shows you the recent massive attack on the 11th of April, where you can see that the Russians try with a mixture of different weapon systems to attack critical infrastructure in the west, means in the depths of the country. The same when we look at the last huge attack in May. Also here a mixture of Iranian drones, ballistical missiles, cruise missiles and hypersonic weapons. And all these weapons aim against the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. When we now look at the operational level and the operational objectives of Russia, we can clearly see that the Russians, by using 6 massive groupings called Sabat, Center, Yug, Vostok, Zaporozhye and Dnieper, to attack along the whole front line, especially in the Donbas region. The aim of these attacks is to force the Ukrainians to use reserve and to destroy this reserve. It is important for the Russians to avoid any forming of future offensive reserve on the Ukrainian side and to maintain the momentum also within the next months. The problem is also that the Russians not only can use their weapons along the whole front line in a close battle, but they also can already attack different weapon systems of the Ukrainian side into the depths behind the front. I would like to show you 2 videos which gives you a clear idea what is happening here. The first video shows an attack against the HIMARS system, a very important Ukrainian multi-rocket launch system, and the second video shows an attack against parts of a Ukrainian Patriot battery. The last level, which is important, is the tactical level. So we have to have a look at the tactical objectives of this level. Here we can see that the Russians try, by using different means, to attack the Ukrainians along the whole front line. These different means are already quite sophisticated, like the use of Lancet kamikaze drones behind the front lines, or of heavy bombs against the strong points along the front lines. Bombs of the type of UMPK with a weight of 1,500 up to 3,000 kilogram. Also here we would like to show you a video of different Lancet strikes against Ukrainian targets. We can come to the first conclusion, and this conclusion is that we are fighting a war of attrition. So a war of attrition has its own nature, it's following its own grammar. It's resources orientated and not orientated related to terrain. So it's very important to understand that in a war of attrition, it's important to have enough resources to fight a long war. I give you one example, and this is artillery. What we can see is that in the main attack areas, the Russians are already using 10,000 artillery shells a day, while the Ukrainians only have about 2,000. In close battle, the Ukrainians try to use first-person view drones to repel the Russian attacks, but they don't have any means to attack the Russian artillery, because those drones only have a limited range of up to 5, sometimes 10 kilometers, while the artillery is positioned in distances at least of 20 kilometers, even higher. And that means, without these artillery shells, the Ukrainians have the problem that they cannot attack the groupings of the Russian side of the artillery, and those Russian artillery groupings are fighting against the Ukrainians, which are outnumbered. Also here we would like to show you a video. In that video you can see the massive use of Russian multi-launch rocket systems in the region of Biloforivka, which is to the east of Siversk. The next remarkable factor is adaptation from the Russian side. What we can see is that the weapon systems which were delivered from the West don't have the precision they had in the beginning of the war. For example, JDAM ERs, Joint Direct Attack Munition Extended Range, have the problem that they are actually jammed to a high scale. The same when it comes to Storm Shadow and Scalp. Also here we can see that the rate of hits have decreased significantly. The same when it comes to the HIMARS system. Also here, between 50 and 70% of the HIMARS rockets are already jammed by the Russian side. And even worse, it's when it comes to the Excalibur. Here the problem is that at the beginning of the war, about 70% of all shots were hitting their target, and now it's about 6%. And also the problem with the drones, because also here the Russians are effectively jamming the up and down link of the Ukrainian drones. That means we can see that especially Russian jamming and electronic warfare has improved a lot. I would like to show you two videos related to that factor. The first video you can actually see the shooting down of a Ukrainian Storm Shadow missile. And the second video shows you another Storm Shadow missile which was found on the ground and which is more or less in detail examined by the Russian side. We can also come to the conclusion that in a war of attrition it's especially a question of resources. We can see that the Russian military spending has increased over the last 2 years. It's said that about 7 or even 8% of the gross domestic product of the Russian state is invested in the war industry. On the other side, we see that the Europeans and the Americans are still struggling to maintain a static flow of resources into Ukraine. As a result, we can conclude that the Russians are gaining more and more momentum, and the momentum is back to the Russians. The Russians try, by using their different groupings, to attack the Ukrainian positions along the whole front line. They are using about 510,000 soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 infantry fighting vehicles, 5,000 artillery systems, 1,200 multi-round rocket systems, 300 helicopters and 300 aircraft. The Russian morale is boosted by the fact that more and more Western equipment is destroyed and even shown to the Russian people in exhibitions. These two pictures were made in Moscow on the 9th of May this year, the day of victory. And you can see that those pictures, of course, give the Russian morale a boost. The Russian winter offensive was marked by several battles which were fought along the whole Ukrainian front line. I would like to give you some examples. One example was the Battle of Avdiivka. The Russians tried by using two pincers to attack the Ukrainian city of Avdiivka and finally gained control over the city. Another example is Ocheretny. In that case, in the region northwest of Avdiivka, the Russians managed to break into the second line of defense of the Ukrainians. The Russians were saying that the flower of Ocheretny had started to bloom. Why do I say bloom? Because the Russians are trying now to extend the penetration into the second line of defense and to extend this penetration even further to the west. Another example is the battle for Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar is to the west of Bakhmut. At the moment, the Russians are trying to gain a foothold on the other side of an artificial channel which is going from the north to the south. What we know is that the Russians very likely already managed to form a bridgehead on the other side of the channel, and their aim is to capture these heights to the west of the channel and to have a foothold for a further attack direction west. A completely new situation has developed in the north of Kharkiv, which is the second biggest city in Ukraine. Here we have seen a new grouping of the Russian side, the grouping Sever, which means north. This grouping is equipped with about 400 main battle tanks, 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles, about 1,000 artillery systems, and it's assisted by 25 fixed-wing aircraft and 25 rotary-wing aircraft. Those units are attacking from the north direction to the south, and the Russians were able, in a very short time frame, to gain a remarkable foothold in the north of Kharkiv. The aim of this attack is threefold. First, they try to form a buffer zone to the north of Kharkiv. Second, they force the Ukrainians to use new reserves to the north of Kharkiv. And third, they form a staging area for any future operations against the city of Kharkiv. That means we can come to the conclusion that we are now transforming from phase 6 to phase 7, the possible Russian summer offensive. Just recently, General Budanov, who is the head of the Ukrainian military intelligence service, pointed out very clearly that we can expect a full Russian summer offensive in the next weeks and months to come. This new Russian summer offensive very likely will not only take place in the Donbass, but maybe very likely also to the north. That means not only in Kharkiv, but also maybe in Sumy region. And the problem is that this will extend the Ukrainian front line of about another 400 to 500 kilometers. We can also see that the Russians are using already different types of new weapons and assets. So we can see that their tanks have improved. We can see that they're using more and more infantry in a very sophisticated manner. We see the success of Russian jamming and electronic warfare, and we see more and more artillery, more and more of these FAB UMPK bombs, and of course first-person patrols. Also here we can see a new development. We see that the war is fought more and more in an autonomous way. I would like to show you a video where you can see Russian ground robots trying to reconnoiter Ukrainian strong point, and those robots are attacked by Ukrainian first-person view drones. So while the Ukrainians are struggling to get their resources to the front to fight this war of attrition, it is obvious that the Allies struggle to assist the Ukrainians. One good example is the United States. It looks like that the United States have a global strategy and they try to make sure that it is not escalating on a global level. I'll give you two examples. First, obviously the Americans don't like that the Ukrainians try to attack Russian targets in the deeps of the country, because this might increase the price of certain goods on the oil market. On the other side, we see also that the Americans try to moderate somehow the conflict in Gaza because they're trying to force the Israelis not to escalate the situation in Rafah. And that gives you a clear example that there is some kind of a grand strategy behind it. The elephant in the room, of course, is also the question, what about all these nuclear weapons we see especially in the Russian arsenals? And we know today that in 2022 it was already maybe very close to a possible use of tactical nuclear weapons, because at that time when there was the fight of the Russians in the bridgehead of Kherson, especially American intelligence services thought that there will be the use of nuclear weapons from the Russian side. And it was the case that with the help of Indian and Chinese negotiations, it was possible to calm down the situation. But when we look in detail into the information domain, we can see that the Russians are trying to play with us. They try to spread fear because they show us that they have these assets available in their arsenals. Therefore, we would like to show you a video of the launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile from the Russian type Topol. And this is a clear indicator that the Russians try to spread fear in the information domain. And when it comes to fear, it's always a bad advisor when it comes to decisions you have to make on the battlefield. In addition, we have always to consider that the Russians also have other assets we might have not on the table immediately. One clear example is the space domain. Just recently, the Americans sounded off and told us that the Russians very likely have launched an anti-satellite weapon. And that gives you a clear indication that the Russians, of course, in addition to the assets they have in the land war in Ukraine, have further assets, especially in different other domains, like I have explained before, in the space domain. So the question is, what about the allies? So we see that the Americans and the Europeans are delivering sophisticated weapon systems. Like, for example, the ATACMS, these ground-to-ground launched rocket systems. And of course, they are used and they have success. I would like to show you a video where you can see the use of such systems against an ammunition depot fully equipped with UMPK bombs. And you can see that those strikes have a devastating effect. But there is the military principle of saturation. What does it mean? It means that those attacks have to be conducted on a daily basis in a certain time frame in a way that you really can see measurable effects on the battlefield. That means, for example, a stop of the Russian attack. And we still don't see those measurable effects. So we see striking attacks with Western weapon systems, but we don't see measurable effects on the battlefield, like, for example, we have seen with the HIMARS system in 2022, the so-called HIMARS effect. There is still no ATACMS effect. On the other side, you can obviously see that Russia have very trustable allies and even friends. So we know that China, for example, is delivering certain goods which the Russians can use for their armament production. We also know that the Iranians are delivering drones on a high scale, drones of the type of Shahid. It's said that several thousand of them were delivered to Russia, and with the help of Iran, Russia is already able to produce its own Shahid drones, which they call Garand-2. We also have countries like North Korea. It's said that the Russians last year produced 3 million shells of artillery rounds, while the North Koreans delivered another 2 million. So that means 5 million artillery rounds were available. So the question is, are we closing into a culmination point? And a culmination point is a situation from the military perspective which you should avoid, because if you cross over the culmination point, you can never return. And that means for Ukraine that very hard weeks and months are coming. And when you look at the statements of Ukrainian officials like the president or even military personnel, you can see how desperate the situation is. Here we would like to show you a video showing the Ukrainian president who tried to explain very clearly and straightforward how the situation is and why it is so important that they have assistance from the West.
Використовувати як захист. Як їм відповісти, коли вони б'ють по твоїх містах? І їх далекобійність така, тому що вони стоять в найближчих селах до кордону України з Росії звідти б'ють, знаючи, що ми бити не будемо, знаючи, що вони прикриваються цивільним населенням, бо розташування їх зброї серед цивільного населення Російської Федерації. Але вони спокійно на це йдуть, розуміючи, що наші партнери не дають нам дозвіл, як ви сказали. І тут, коли ми говоримо про атакамси, або ми говоримо про хаймарси, або ми говоримо про артилерійський снаряд, або ми говоримо про відповідні ракети, Storm Shadow, скальпи тощо, ми не маємо дозволу бити по території Російської Федерації, по їх військовим розташуванням, штабам тощо. Це те саме, що ППО. Як нам захиститись від постійних ударів з території Росії? За 100 кілометрів до точки в Україні або до кордону України вони б'ють ракетами з російської території. Як нам захистити?
So the question is, will the Ukrainians be supplied with all the assets they need? They need more aircraft, so for example F-16s. They need more tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and especially ammunition. They also need more air defense, not only 1 or 2 Patriot systems. They need 5 to 10 Patriot systems. They need more of these ATACMS, these ground-to-ground launched missiles, or precision-guided ammunition, and of course they need more soldiers. This is the question which is discussed heavily in the Ukrainian Rada, the question of mobilization. And only these supplies will give Ukraine the possibility to win the war or have a strong position in any future negotiations related to peace or at least some kind of a stalemate. And the aim of the conference is to show the Western world how desperate the situation in Ukraine is and to form a coalition of the willing in assistance of Ukraine. At the end of my today's brief, I would like to say a few words about myself. As a general staff officer, you have to command a battalion-sized unit for a certain time frame. I did this by commanding the Guards unit for 1.5 years. This is now concluded and I have returned to the Austrian Military Academy, where I'm heading now the Institute on Officers Basic Training, which is a very, very important task because it's now on us to train the future officers of the Austrian Armed Forces, young men and women, and to make sure that they have a clear understanding on the future of war and how the battlefield is changing. And because of the fact that we want to improve ourselves, we are trying to conduct high-level conferences where we invite internationals to have a clear understanding of what was going on the battlefield and to make sure that this information is transferred into the training of the Austrian officers. That concludes my today's briefing. I would like to say thank you very much and see you the next time.